I just want to test my sound. Is this better? Because I understand it was hard to hear me before.
I can hear you okay. I don't know how others are.
Yeah, loud and clear for me.
Okay, great. I decluttered my computer area. I think it was just the clutter that was blocking the sound a little bit.
Welcome, Brian. Welcome, Tim. Morning, Aaron.
Morning.
So we are at 9:30, so we should probably, are we live yet?
We've ended the practice session, I believe.
Okay. So we'll wait a couple minutes. Looks like try to get a few more folks in the room, and then we'll kick us off officially. Morning, Aaron. Got your note, Andrea. Thank you. And we'll just note, we'll mark you as here, so I won't call you out and make you acknowledge yourself. Appreciate it. Welcome, Elaine. So we'll do one more minute, see if we get folks, and then we'll just jump in and do some of our housekeeping, see if we get more folks to start joining. Give another 60 seconds or so. Morning, Fred. Welcome, Joshua. All right, well, why don't we see folks popping in. Why don't we pull up the opening slide? We'll dive right in and get the meeting going. And we want to hit record. Are we already recording? Oh, sorry, we're already recording. All right, I've got to catch up with this. Well, welcome everyone to the Oregon Department of Energy Advisory Group Meeting 8, March 20th. Just as a reminder, Ben Duncan, your facilitator with Kearns and West. Good to be with you all today. So do a little bit of housekeeping as we get the conversation started today. If we go to the next slide. Just a reminder of kind of the mission and role that the Department of Energy plays in the state, and the reminder of the broader mission that you all are connecting and contributing to as we do this work together. We go to the next slide. Folks have been on this platform for WebEx, but a couple Key pieces, one, if you look top right, you can there's a couple raise your hand options. So one up in the top if you go into the kind of panelist participants box, or on the bottom where you see reactions or a raised hand button, you can click on that to raise your hand, get into queue. Helps me as a facilitator determine kind of the order of operations. We do have a chat function on the bottom right. Please use the everyone chat, particularly for folks in the audience to be able to see, and remembering to be mindful of the utilization of chat so it's not distracting. The video function at the bottom of your screen, stop and start video. Of course, we always encourage folks who can to be on video, create the experience of trying to be in community, also helpful for the audience. And then the mute and unmute button is right next to that on the bottom left. Any point you get into challenges with technology, who's our tech person? Is it Mary? Should I communicate?
Me.
Josh.
Price.
Okay, thanks, Josh. So if any tech issues during, please use the chat and just communicate with Josh Price. So we'll move on from WebEx to some of our group agreements. Again, we have had really great conversations around, but I'll just remind folks in order to kind of curate and cultivate productive conversations that we've been intentional with the agenda, so really honoring and following the pathway that we've laid out, really seeking to learn and understand from each other, to be candid, to be constructive, to seek solutions, to ask questions, and certainly we'll have some space today to, again, really ensure that folks have clarity around the content and topics that we're just discussing, being accountable to yourself and to each other, deep respect for the many different opinions and interests that are around this room. And to the extent that, maybe not today, but as we get into our work, seeking common ground and identifying ways to resolve difference and finding constructive paths forward. Pay attention to how much you're speaking, and I'll do the same. And again, as I said earlier, just being really mindful of not using chat disruptively as kind of virtual side conversations. So with that, I'll pass it to Edith to kind of lay out how we're going to spend our time together.
Thanks, Ben, and good morning, everybody. So as you noticed, we have a shorter meeting today, and I'd just like to give some context to that as I talk about the meeting objectives. So we're at a stage in the process where we've had a set of working group meetings structured around key findings from the modeling as a starting point to talk about key challenges and barriers to meeting our state's energy policy objectives. So we've mainly focused on those key challenges and barriers and have not yet gotten into the deeper discussion on policy solutions. We're sort of at a midway point where we have this kind of laundry list of barriers that we've been working to synthesize and to kind of think about and categorize and understand the interaction between what we've been hearing. And what we'd like to propose is to report back on kind of where we are in that synthesis and what we've been hearing from the working groups, how we've structured those discussions, and how we plan to take them forward. And we'd really love to hear your questions and to collect any reactions or feedback on what the team presents today, or really more broadly on anything that you've been hearing around the working groups or around the energy strategy. Anything that gives you pause or that you find particularly interesting would all be great feedback. We also want to reserve a few minutes at the end of the meeting to talk about the bigger picture and give you some context for our next meeting. You'll remember that we sent around a survey asking whether we hold any of our upcoming meetings in person. And I'd like to come back to the idea of holding our next meeting in person. Based on the responses we got, it sounded like an in-person meeting in Portland might be something that folks would be interested in. And it might be worthwhile for our next meeting to do it that way, since we anticipate that we'll be digging in more deeply into the policy discussions. And we'll also want to spend much more time digging in that meeting into what we're hearing and thinking around policy ideas, and really spending less time presenting and more time having a conversation. And that's easier to do in person. So I frame that up and then I'm going to bring us back now to today, where again, we're talking about that first set of working group meetings, what we heard. We're going to have the leads for each of those working groups present, and then we'll have some time for a conversation. So Ben, with that, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great, thanks. So let's go to the next slide and really in service to what Edith just described. It's a pretty straightforward agenda, so we'll move through some of our housekeeping, including the approval of the summary of the last meeting, and then really have some ample space, as Edith described, to talk about some of the work that's happening in the work groups, key challenges and barriers coming out of those discussions, and providing some opportunity and discussion to get clarity, to lift up things that are top of mind for you all, and really just create some space to make sure that we're kind of understanding those barriers and getting a sense from you all, kind of what's of most interest. And then we'll close and get you out of here at 11 o'clock. So let's keep moving. So I'm going to work through a roll call. So if you can just say I or here or some mechanism to know that you're in the room. Aaron Orlowski.
Hello, yes, good morning, everyone.
Thanks, Aaron. This is your mic check as well. And Andrea Kreiner, we know you're here, but in a public space offline or online off camera. Brian Adams.
Yes, good morning. Brian's here. Glad to see you.
Thanks, Brian. Good to see you. Kathy. After Kathy, Charity. Christine.
I'm here.
Thank you. Corey.
Good morning.
Thank you. Diane or Emily, let's see. Diane Brett.
Diane, yeah, I'm here today. Good morning.
Great, thank you. Elaine.
Yeah, hi, good morning.
Thank you. Aaron Childs.
Morning.
Morning. Fred Hewitt.
Morning, everybody.
Thank you. Ivy. Let's see, Ivy, yeah. Jeff Hammerland. I saw you, Jeff.
Jeff Hammerland, Pure PSU.
Great, thank you. Jennifer Hill-Hart. Okay, Jennifer Jolly.
Yes, I'm here for Tucker and Scott Sims.
Yep, thank you, Jennifer. Jimmy Lindsay. So Jimmy, Joshua.
Morning.
Morning. Juan. Thought I saw you, Juan Barraza. Oh, there's a wave and a thumbs up. Okay, there you are. Thank you. Mary Kyle.
Mary Kyle McCurdy with 1000 Friends of Oregon. My colleague Andrew Mulkey was in this position before, but he's now in a different role. Thank you.
Great, and welcome, Mary Kyle. So we'll look forward to having you as part of the group here going forward. Appreciate you. Mary Marlins. Nate Hill. Patrick Mills. Rakesh.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Robert Wallace. Scott Sims. Shannon Susan.
I'm here for Scott, Jennifer Jolly.
Oh, yes, sorry, I should have, you said that and I didn't register as I looked at names. Thank you for that reminder. Shannon Souza. Yep, I see you, thank you. And then Tim McMahon.
Good morning, Tim McMahon here.
Okay, did I miss anybody or did somebody come in after the alphabetical order?
I just want to note, Ben, that Mary Marlin sent a note that she'll be here, but she'll be a little bit late, so she'll join us shortly.
Okay, great, thank you, Edith. Okay, well, let's keep moving then. So we do this at every meeting, just making sure we had an accurate capture and reflection of the previous conversation. So I'll just ask for hands up if there was any edits, corrections, points of clarity for the February 20th meeting summary. Okay, last call for edits, corrections, points of clarity. Not seeing any, we will consider the February 20th meeting notes and summary approved. Thank you all. Okay. Edith.
All right, thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody. So if we can go to the next slide, I just want to tee up the discussion today with a couple of kind of reminder slides. So this is the first one, just reminding us all that there are 5 working groups. Each met, they all came together on February 12th in a plenary session where we talked a little bit more about the modeling results and kind of teed up the upcoming meetings. Since then, each group has met at least once separately. So each of these groups is meeting 3 times between the 2 plenary sessions that we have scheduled. So that first round of meetings has happened, and a few of them have met a second time very recently. So our team is not presenting on kind of what came out of those meetings today, since we're just working to synthesize a lot of content that came in those meetings. All of these groups will come back together on May 21st, and that'll be the last working group meeting that we envision, and that will also be a plenary meeting, just to give you a sense of how this is all working. If we go to the next slide, here's a summary of the process we're following with each working group for those 3 kind of breakout meetings for each of the groups. Today, we're going to focus on what you see here as meeting 2. So this example is from the low carbon fuels group. So kind of on the left, there are different kind of pathways or ways that we've structured the conversation. And then in that second meeting, we talked primarily about issue statements and about barriers to meeting our energy policy objectives. Those discussions, as I said before, have been teed up with key insights from the modeling, and with some additional insights to ground us where we are today in key areas like energy consumption in buildings, or what does the EV market share look like today, or how does fuel use across transportation look today. So we've done kind of a combination of key insights from the modeling and also a bit of grounding in data that's available. And we've also teed up existing policies that relate to each working group topic for discussion as well. And that's all served as background for the conversations that we've been having. Each working group has followed a similar format. So we've used, and some of you have been in these meetings, some of you haven't, but for those who haven't, we've been using a virtual whiteboard to brainstorm around key challenges and barriers. And that working group participants have had some space there to reflect and share their thoughts on these kind of virtual sticky notes that are anonymous. And so we kind of just see them pop up and then use that as a foundation for the discussion to ask whether somebody wants to speak to a sticky note that they put on there. Also gives us a sense of what's in everybody's head, so everybody can kind of read each other's notes and build off of that. So each group's whiteboards are available online, and we can drop some links here in the chat for anybody who wants to dig in further. The recordings of the meetings are online, as well as the presentation. So all that material is available. And I'd just like to you all today to just keep in mind this kind of progressive structure that we have, where each meeting builds on the other. So while we're talking about meeting 2, it's really preparing us to dig in more to strategies to overcome barriers, and leading into that 4th meeting where we really dig into potential policy actions. And that those 4th meetings most of them are happening on April 30th. We have a bunch of meetings happening that day, and then there's one the following week. So with that structure in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Rob to talk about the buildings group and what we've been hearing there.
Thank you, Edith. My name is Rob Delmar, and I'm the facilitator for the Building Electrification, Efficiency, and Distributed Energy Resources Policy Working Group. And before we get into the takeaways from our whiteboarding and meetings exercises, I just wanted to reiterate a few key takeaways from the modeling relating to this building electrification and efficiency. So the first key takeaway was that electrification and efficiency and demand response measures are all significant drivers of cost savings in Oregon's energy future. And if we delay these measures, that causes significantly higher costs to show up in the model. Second, building electrification results in system-wide reductions in energy demand, and aggressive adoption of heat pumps can cut total energy use for commercial and residential space heating in half by 2050. And that's because of the efficiency gains that you get with a heat pump over either electric resistance or gas furnaces. Increasing rooftop solar in Western Oregon has higher costs, but it reduces the need for grid scale solar in Eastern Oregon. And so each gigawatt of rooftop solar in Western Oregon displaces a little over half a gigawatt of east side solar, which is equivalent to about 2,500 acres of land. And finally, demand response programs reduce the amount of new electricity capacity and transmission needed while providing financial benefits to Oregon utility customers. So those are our 4 primary takeaways from the model. Next slide, please. Now we'll jump into some of the content from our policy working group meetings. And Edith mentioned a whiteboarding exercise that we've all been doing in the meetings. And what you see to the right here is a whole bunch of sticky notes that are not actually legible at this scale, but we've got these categorized according to the different sort of buckets of barriers that they fit into. And we use this categorization to not necessarily prioritize what needs to be done first, but to kind of quantify where the biggest barriers are and to recognize that the barriers are pretty diverse. And so one of the first barriers that we see in all of these measures is upfront cost continuing to be a significant barrier to adoption. Also, consumer education has come up a lot, and we need to do a better job of conveying the benefits of efficiency and electrification upgrades. Whole home weatherization is often a very necessary first step for health and safety concerns, but it's also very costly. And in some cases, those costs can be a barrier to doing other measures that you might otherwise want to do without the whole home weatherization. Another thing we've heard in a few different settings is that in heat pump systems are not always performing to customer expectations. And this is true both for the initial heat pump performance as well as long-term maintenance issues. And this is kind of exacerbated in rural Oregon, where there can be some workforce concerns to support installations. And finally, in the low-income and rental housing markets, there are additional challenges. Oregon's incentive programs have traditionally struggled to serve low-income populations. And in rental situations, landlords who would be funding an upgrade don't necessarily see those benefits. So there's an additional level of complexity for rental properties. Next slide, please. This was a similar exercise for large commercial and industrial. And in this case, the barriers that rose to the top were difficulties of electrification. And we just heard that some large commercial and industrial loads are not really feasible to electrify right now. And that as low carbon fuels become available and we get some technology improvements, that those may become feasible in the future. But right now there are just some loads that are really hard to electrify, especially in the industrial space. And we also found that business and industry partners would appreciate comprehensive strategies that look at their sort of energy systems in a more holistic way, so that efficiency, electrification, adoption of distributed energy resources, how can all of these stack up to make sound business decisions? And so we need to do a better job of big picture for large commercial and industrial. Next slide, please. This was our discussion specifically relating to distributed energy resources. And this one you can see in the sort of sticky bar chart on the right that cost continues to be the overwhelming barrier for these systems. And that's been the case for years. And we've seen some significant cost declines, but cost is still the biggest barrier. There are also some interconnection and net metering barriers relating to utility policies and practices. And then there are also barriers associated with the marketplace not yet recognizing all of the values that these systems can bring. And those values are not just needed to be conveyed to the customer so that they can see the value in, say, backup energy for resilience, but also the market does not yet value some of the things these systems can do. And they do provide potentially valuable grid benefits, but those have not yet really been quantified in Oregon. And finally, technology improvements are needed to enable maximum values to be realized. And this is when we think about distributed energy resources, often we think of rooftop solar, but we also consider, electric vehicles to be distributed energy resources. And like with the technology improvements, we talk a lot about things like vehicle to grid technologies that are just not really there yet. So that's what we heard when we talked about technology improvements for DERS. Next slide, please. Finally, demand response. And this is a case where if you look at the bar chart, a lot of the comments were lack of customer buy-in. That was the majority of the comments. But the next bar over is the relating to utility programs, both availability of programs and their design. And so without those utility programs, customers have nothing to really buy into. And so we found that many Oregon utilities have not yet implemented demand response programs. That has exacerbated the issue that there's a lack of customer understanding and buy-in for how demand response can work and how customers can benefit. And again, we see these same technology improvements that are needed to really maximize benefits and values to the customers of these systems. And that is my final slide.
Good.
So-
Well, Rob, just before we keep moving, so Aaron, you had a question in the chat. Does the statement "no feasible alternative to fossil fuels" reflect that end users experience challenges getting access to clean fuels, or that clean fuels are unable to meet the end use applications currently served by fossil fuels?
Yeah, and this one, I was careful in the way I worded this to use the term feasible, because that often includes an economic component. And so in some cases, there are technological solutions in that there could be alternate fuels available or some means of electrification, but for a business operator, they're not economically feasible yet. And I think in some cases there are true technological barriers as well. So we didn't get into a lot of detail on that one, except to hear that we're just not there yet for some of the larger industrial loads, like like I think agriculture, drying of crops and canning and things like that were mentioned. That a lot of these systems have been built on a natural gas infrastructure, and the availability and price point for alternative fuels just hasn't really made it in the marketplace.
Good, thank you. Well, let's keep moving. We're going to have space for discussion. So if there's burning questions, throw them in the chat or raise your hand as we hear the presenters. But we will have some additional space for conversation.
And
So
I think Jeff's hand's raised. He raised it a little bit ago.
Oh, Jeff. Yes, sorry. Thank you.
Well, I can wait too.
You ask your question, Jeff.
It's a question for Rob. So this was a great presentation, Rob. I'm not in this group, but I've learned a lot here. I would just add a couple of things. When you're talking about the market barriers, one of the issues we always have is getting, the real estate agents, the zone, the applications for loans, all those things to incorporate the energy efficiency and demand response features in the home. That's always an issue. And then I also wanted to mention, so, you know, to get so that if a property owner or if a future home buyer wants to buy a property, that will be considered in the cost of the loan and the benefits of that building. The other thing is that grid reliable, efficient buildings, that whole part of demand response where buildings can become good citizens within the grid. I didn't see that in any of the slides yet, in any of the DR slides, but I'm hoping that will be addressed at some point.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Those are two excellent points. And your first point was actually brought up in our last meeting, which just happened yesterday, which was more solutions oriented,
Okay.
which is a more difficult solution. But we did talk about the point of consumer education, and that point of getting a loan was one of those kind of touch points where we thought that there's an opportunity for some education around DERS and demand response and even efficiency measures like we see in home energy scores in Portland and in Bend. So yeah, thinking about that, where are the opportunities for consumer education?
Educating the building appraisers, educating the inspectors, that whole piece is just always needs good work.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And to your second point, that's another really good one, to have a little more holistic view of how buildings fit into our communities and how they can give back. And so I'm gonna definitely incorporate that into our next meeting and when we really start talking about solutions and policy options. So thanks.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Rob. Let's move into transportation.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jillian Demedio. I'm the transportation lead for the Oregon Energy Strategy and the facilitator of the Transportation Electrification Policy Working Group. So as a reminder, in this group, we're covering topics related to vehicle electrification. So that's for light, medium, and heavy duty and other vehicles, including both battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicles, as well as charging and fueling infrastructure. We also cover topics related to grid integration. So that can include things like charging interconnection, utility planning and upgrades, managed charging, and vehicle to grid. And then lastly, reducing vehicle miles traveled. So things like transit and biking, investment in infrastructure, land use considerations, and transportation planning. The modeling exercise provided 4 key takeaways related to transportation, which are listed here on this slide and also explained further in our key findings document, which I believe we've shared before. We've talked about these findings, so I'm not going to go into more detail, but I just wanted to sort of note them and say that the TE Policy Working Group is focused on the first 3, as I just said, and the Low Carbon Fuels Working Group will focus on that last transportation-related key finding related to low carbon fuels. So I think we can go to the next slide. So our TE Policy Working Group, as Edith mentioned, had our second meeting on March 4th, and that was focused primarily on barriers to the 3 topics that I just mentioned: vehicle electrification, grid integration, and VMT reduction. It was a very engaged conversation. We had a lot of feedback, close to 300 comments on our sticky whiteboard. And in going through all of those comments, there were certain themes that kind of emerged for each topic area. And that's what I'm sharing with you today. So we're going to kind of cover these by topic. So this is first vehicle electrification. And you can see the themes kind of listed in that first column alongside the number of comments related. So you can get a sense of the scale and sort of how common it is that topic came up. And so first we have high costs and lack of funding. This biggest theme is probably not a surprise to anybody. Zero emission vehicles still cost more than their internal combustion engine counterparts. And the incentive programs that exist are not sufficient to sort of overcome that upfront cost. And particularly with all of the federal uncertainty that's sort of happening right now. A lot of those funding programs are federally funded. The next big barrier here was around consumer and dealer awareness. So there are still many myths that persist around electric vehicles, and many consumers and dealers and others are not aware of the health, environmental, and economic benefits that they offer, nor of their operational capabilities. Charger reliability and maintenance was another big topic. People find that charging stations are still unreliable, and they're often difficult or expensive to repair due to whether it's poor design, bad charging station companies, or a big theme was the lack of a skilled and qualified workforce to do that maintenance work. Relating to interoperability and standards, there's still a lack of interoperability between charging station hardware and software equipment, as well as between chargers, vehicles, and the grid. And this is combined with a lack of standardized systems around user interface, so connector types and payment systems, and that both of these things can lead to charger downtime as well as consumer confusion. We talked a lot about the large learning curve for fleets that do wish to transition their vehicles to zero emission vehicles. That includes things like navigating grant applications and reporting processes, training drivers and staff, and understanding the right infrastructure to install, and the fact that there is no statewide technical assistance available for that. Charging and fueling access is still a problem as infrastructure is still pretty limited in Oregon, particularly in certain locations like workplaces, in rural communities, for rental unit and multifamily housing residents, and for drivers of particularly heavy duty vehicles. And then lastly, barriers around the medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle technology itself. So in some medium and heavy duty sectors and use cases, there are limited commercially available options for zero emission vehicles. So you can go to the next slide. So moving on now to our second topic of grid integration. Again, we have the barrier theme listed in the first column here and how many comments were kind of relevant. So first we have load management, distributed energy resources, and battery energy storage systems kind of all combined into one. Load management strategies, and Rob already sort of highlighted this. This came up in his group as well. Load management strategies and technologies are not well understood or developed right now, and managed charging programs in particular are not widespread, nor are they really tuned to maximize participation the way that they're designed right now. Relating to utility capacity upgrades and interconnection, obviously a lot of these EV charging sites require a pretty large power demand, particularly those that are designed for medium and heavy duty vehicles, and that's often coupled with limited grid capacity in many parts of the state. And so that results in high utility upgrade costs and high costs and timelines for that interconnection. We talked a lot about public utilities and how they don't have the same resources available to them as investor-owned utilities, particularly around transportation, electrification, resources, financial resources, but also expertise to help customers electrify. And there's also not a very clear price signal coming from BPA for public utilities to institute managed charging programs or time of use rates. Regarding sort of historic investments and planning by utilities, typically utilities invest in new infrastructure when they have a sort of known and identified demand rather than proactively in anticipation of growth, and that can be a barrier. And utilities right now are particularly hesitant to invest proactively without that certainty of cost recovery. Next barrier around utility rates. This can range from high electricity costs in some areas, demand charges, and regional variability, to, we also talked about sort of lack of tiered rate structures for low income customers, and also a lack of rates that truly reflect the grid benefits that electric vehicles can provide. And then lastly, on this topic, consumer awareness, particularly related to load management. Consumers are still reluctant, even if they do have managed charging programs available, there's still that reluctance to opt into managed charging, maybe due to a lack of sufficient incentives from the utility, sort of mistrust of the corporation, or a misconception around data privacy or whether or not their vehicle will be available to them whenever they want it. Next slide. And then lastly, our last topic here is related to VMT reduction. So first, kind of the most common theme was around transit investment, noting a lack of sufficient transit and a lack of sustainable funding to maintain or expand current service and improve access, particularly in low density areas. Transportation funding was also noted. We have a lack of a sustainable funding system for road maintenance and alternative transportation in Oregon. And the funding that we do have does not prioritize those alternative transportation modes. Related to transportation options for rural and low income residents, rural and low income residents often face longer distances to essential goods and services. And have a lack of viable alternatives to their single occupancy vehicles. So that would include things like transit and ride sharing. Related to development, historical development patterns tended to favor vehicle travel, and the policies that have been recently incorporated to encourage VMT reduction are still sort of catching up. So that development pattern is still a barrier. Related to cultural perceptions, there's still a strong cultural preference in our country and in Oregon for personal vehicle ownership and use, and negative impressions related to alternative transportation modes. We still have safety concerns around alternative transportation modes that will include biking and transit safety, and often constraints and high costs for safety improvements. And then lastly, related to intermodal system completeness, there are still gaps in the multimodal system that make it difficult if you're trying to connect various modes of transportation. So first and last mile, for example, or if you want to, take your bike to a bus, do you have a place to put that bike while you ride the bus? Things like that. So that is kind of a high level. This is, of course, not an exhaustive list of everything we talked about, but these were the major themes that emerged in our conversation.
Thanks,
and
Jill.
I think, if there, I don't know if there are questions.
Well,
Ben,
there was
so I'll
a
let you handle that.
comment. So Jennifer, I'd love to just invite you in, recognizing your last statement, Jillian, that this was kind of a reflection of where the work group was. But Jennifer, you want to lift up what you put in the chat?
I was just I noted in the summary, and of course, this is just one person's opinion, but I wouldn't agree with the observation that COUs have limited transportation electrification resources and expertise. Some COUs have very, very robust programs. I mean, the city of Ashland has free public charging, multiple free chargers. There's a lot of incentives that have been funded by COUs with clean fuel credit dollars. So I worry about, some of these comments being rolled up in your energy strategy as, endorsed by ODO. So I know ODO has the final say so on what is put in the strategy, and I hope that you'll use some editing and be a little more judicious in some of the characterizations. I know just as a participant in one of the other work groups, I found that Miro process very frustrating, and I didn't even participate in the conversation. So, I hope that the agency exercises some, editing on some of these comments, because it was a subset of certain work group members that were really dominating the conversation and getting their Post-it notes up, whereas I, who had no familiarity with the tool, was able to get maybe one in. So for what it's worth.
Thank you, Jennifer. And again, this is, of course, a point in time reflection of what the agency has heard in those working groups. But I think, and I'll look to my Odo folks here, like this is part of the reason we're having this conversation. Part of the hope from this discussion today is that you all are offering either a little bit of pushback, points of clarity, opportunities to kind of lift up things that you want to name as the agency continues to go through this process of working groups. And I'll just hold the other piece for the agency to hear, just around, folks' familiarity and comfort using different tools and models to collect information. So thanks, Jennifer, for lifting that up. Jeff? You're on mute if you're talking to us, though, Jeff.
Sorry, I'm muting myself. Sorry about that. Well, great presentation again. I just wanted to mention that one other area that I probably should be addressed in the transportation group, but it could be elsewhere. I'm not sure. It needs to be addressed at some point. Way back when I was the deputy mayor of Beaverton back in the 1990s, seems such a long ago, and long time ago, I was also the senior transportation planner. And at the time, we were working on something created by the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development folks called the Transportation Planning Rule. I think it was Goal 12. Basically, what it was doing was having the cities in the metropolitan areas of Oregon rethink all their building codes, zoning codes, development codes, and so on to make them more bicycle, pedestrian, and public transit friendly, and less focus on encouraging single occupancy automobile travel. And I'm thinking that we did the low-hanging fruit there, but there's so much more work that can be done. I was delighted to see that Mary McCurdy is joining our group because Thousand Friends of Oregon was a real leader on that. Anyway, I'm thinking that would be something to address. Yes, we're going to go with electric vehicles, electric buses, and so on, but there's a big transition period there, and we want to encourage people to not just drive with single occupancy cars. So anyway, I'd like to get that addressed in some way in this Oregon energy strategy. And this might be the right group for it.
Yeah, appreciate that. Rakesh?
Thank you for the presentation. For a couple of years, we've been talking about cost of ownership and infrastructure readiness as significant pacing items for decarbonization and transportation electrification, specifically for medium and heavy duty side of things, which is my core responsibility. The other I wanted to mention, and I don't know, was discussed in a working group, is just the regulatory scape. And by that, I mean regulatory requirements with respect to greenhouse gas, for example, as well as advanced clean truck rule, which is a rule today by California, and there are several states, including Oregon, that have opted into that rule. So that would be the additional driver for the pace of decarbonization and transportation electrification, and whatever happens with that rule in the future will have a bearing on the energy strategy as well.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Rakesh. Well, let's keep moving. Joni, what's next? Is it Joni? Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Awesome.
Thank you, Ben. Next slide, please. Perfect. Thank you. So hello, everyone. I'm Joni Slager. I'm leading the Developing Clean Electricity Generation and Transmission Policy Working Group. Reminder, as Edith said, this group is focused on electricity generation and storage in front of the meter, transmission, and the development needs and competing priorities associated with those. The energy pathways modeling, we provided 5 key takeaways for this group, which are listed on the slide here, and also explained further in a key findings document, which I'll ask if someone on Odo can drop the link to that in the chat. The first is that the model shows pretty significant near-term load growth. The reference scenario indicated by 2030, electricity demand in Oregon could increase approximately 40%. And we notice the biggest near-term driver of that is new tech loads, which includes data centers. There's a lot of uncertainty with that load growth. Even if only half of it showed up by 2030, the modeling showed demand could still increase over 25%. The next key finding was that both in-state and out-of-state resources contribute to a least cost supply portfolio. In all the scenarios, the model selected a supply mix that included both of those. And we had a result showing that access to fewer in-state electricity generation resources necessarily increased imports, but also had higher model costs. We've elevated in that document, there are different effects associated, of course, with developing in-state or out-of-state that the modeling couldn't fully capture, such as opportunities to promote economic development and the impact on a wide range of natural resources. The next key finding was that Oregon doesn't have sufficient physical transmission capacity to meet the modeled electricity flows. Energy pathways modeling is not a sophisticated transmission model, but it does show even in a perfectly efficient use of the current transmission system, there was a need to expand the transmission capacity to reach other states and other areas. That indicates a consistent need for additional physical transmission capacity to be built. Next key finding was on the need to build more generating capacity with more demand. Every scenario showed a substantial increase in installed capacity to serve Oregon needs. The types of capacity selected varies somewhat across scenarios. We recognize it's not certain exactly what resources will be available and most cost competitive to meet Oregon's electricity demand over the coming years. And finally, that decarbonizing Oregon's electricity may require more policy action. Modeling the clean electricity targets in House Bill 2021 drove significant emissions reductions across all scenarios, and the economy-wide decarbonization targets in Executive Order 2004 drove further reductions. These modeling results are uncertain. It's uncertain whether they will occur as modeled absent further policy direction and support. So that was what we took from the modeling. Next slide, please. I'm going to give a little more context on the structure we took for our group. This is a slide I presented to the working group in our very first meeting back on February 12th to set the stage for the discussions, which is that the modeling results are not the energy strategy. They provide a foundation and direction for our group's discussion. And at a high level, that direction is that electricity is a key fuel for Oregon to meet its climate goals. And there are different pathways for how we can expand our system, but in all scenarios that we modeled, the electricity system has to expand significantly. So that's the modeling direction on the quote, what that Oregon needs. And the group is focused on discussing how we do that. Next slide, please. So Edith mentioned using a matrix, and to provide structure for this group's discussions into expanding the system, I created 4 topical headings. You can see in the first column below. The text might change here. It was an organizational tool to encourage our conversation to really dig into the full scope of challenges and issues before this group, and aim for our conversation to capture different ways we might think about how to expand the electricity system to meet Oregon's future needs. Next slide, please. So like the others, our group met on February 26th to discuss current barriers. We got nearly 200 sticky notes on a virtual whiteboard. Many of the barriers were cross-cutting across those headings I shared and showed up in multiple places on a whiteboard. So I'm not organizing this slide by those headings. I can share that we heard a good amount of a range of barriers from marketplace concerns like cost and supply chain, workforce capacity concerns, both for development and at different levels of government, and barriers in regulatory uncertainty and even existing policies. So on this slide is a list of some of the themes we heard. It's not exhaustive, but it is, I hope, representative of the discussions going on before this group. The first was a concern that current planning efforts are too siloed, both across energy and water, energy types, electricity and gas, and between utility and utility, a desire for more comprehensive and coordinated planning. Next, the information is too limited for finding the best sites for new resources. And that was expressed both in terms of finding best sites to connect to the grid, but also finding best sites for minimizing conflict with competing priorities and community desires. Next, that permitting, heard concerns about permitting being very time consuming for developers. Yet we also heard that the process can be unsatisfactory for affected communities. So continuing that theme of hearing comments on both sides, we heard some differing perspectives on the role of gas to support grid resilience. And we also heard differing perspectives on the challenge and opportunity around new large loads. Finally, within the topic of resilience, we did hear a pretty strong call that there's a need for more education, funding, and technical assistance at the local community level to promote resilience, and some concerns about microgrids facing some regulatory uncertainty at the interface there between utilities and communities and local governments, that it raises some questions about what is the role of the utility and versus other entities. Again, these are not exhausted, but representative of the themes we heard in this group, and I hope provides a sense of the breadth of challenges that this group is engaging in discussions on. Thank you.
Thanks, Joni. I'm not seeing any urgent questions emerge, so we will keep going and then come back in discussion if folks have things that come up. Michael, take us away.
Thank you, Ben. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, great, perfect. Good morning. So my name is Michael Friels. I'm a policy analyst facilitating the Low Carbon Fuels Policy Working Group. So this group is focused on the role of fuels in Oregon's decarbonized energy future. So focusing on supply, production, and distribution of fuels, demand for fuels, and their strategic use. So our policy conversations, just like the other groups, are organized by 4 high-level key takeaways or findings from the model. And so our first one, there's a growing need for low carbon fuels. Over time in the model, especially the reference scenario, a larger proportion of the fuels we consumed are low carbon fuels. And our second takeaway, fuels will need to provide a capacity support for a growing electricity grid. So the modeling found a need for more firm on-demand electricity resources to provide resilience, safety, and support to our growing electricity system. And gas fuel plants are selected in the model as they are the least cost option to provide flexibility and reliability. And the third option, electrification. So electrification is the least cost path for many current fuel applications to transition. So we have to be strategic in how we use low carbon fuels. So in the modeling of the light duty fleet and much of the medium and heavy duty fleet, in the modeling, they are electrified as of 2050. While low carbon fuels are used for aviation, rail, maritime, and all conventional fuels that are still on Oregon's roads. Within the industrial sector, and I know Rob highlighted some of this, and we had some questions around it, energy demand will decrease a little bit over time due to improvement in efficiencies and some electrification, but most of the demand is met by low carbon fuel options within the modeling. And so if we look at the fourth option, declining fuel demand, in the reference scenario, fuel demand declines, but it's critical to maintaining our energy system. And so fuels meet about 70% of Oregon energy demand in 2024 in the model, and that drops to about 26% in 2050. And electrification is the biggest driver of that reduction in demand. Okay, so we go to the next slide. So our group met and certainly discussed, based on those key findings, potential barriers. And this, like the other presenters, this isn't comprehensive of all the feedback we heard. We heard a diversity of feedback, and it's wonderful to look at, and you can go back and watch the recording if you're interested in that. We also have the mural board available to take a look at. And our goal is just to kind of summarize what's happened here and just highlight a couple of interesting selected barriers that were highlighted for the group, but it's not comprehensive every perspective that was provided in our meetings. So starting with the need for low carbon fuel development, so that was that key policy area number 1. We categorized kind of our discussion of the barriers around supply, demand, feedstock, cost, and availability. So within the supply barrier, there is a lack of low carbon fuel production in our region, and the fact that we have to compete with Washington and California for that limited supply. So that was certainly a barrier that was identified and we discussed extensively. So within demand, there's demand barrier in that the market on its own is not driving a demand for low carbon fuels at this time. A lot of it's driven by policy, and so that's a concern. And within feedstock, if we do want to have some fuel production within the state, a feedstock challenge is that many waste or biomass feedstocks that can be used to create fuels within Oregon are far from existing infrastructure and may not be economical to develop. And so that's a kind of a question area of the feasibility around that and the economics of it. And for as far as cost and affordability, just like we heard with transportation electrification and some of the other categories and within buildings, the upfront costs of vehicles, equipment, new technologies, and the infrastructure are a significant hurdle for nascent technologies like we've talked about with hydrogen, but even the existing technologies, a lot of those upfront costs are a real challenge and a barrier. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So looking at dispatchable resources to support the electric grid. So focusing on the barriers for siting these on-demand fuel resources, we categorize these barriers by siting facilities, investments in cost recovery, and community environmental impacts. For siting facilities, there's a lot of concern around the siting and permitting process and the length of time and cost to go through that process. It can be a challenge, and so we certainly identified the challenge that utilities face in that space, as well as developers of projects. And for investments and cost recovery, there's a concern around the access to renewable electricity at a reasonable price, and access to the electricity itself, and at a reasonable price for fuel projects dependent on electricity as a feedstock, like renewable hydrogen projects, or even other fuel development projects. And then another barrier as far as siting these facilities. So these dispatchable resources, fuel-based dispatchable resources, would likely be near load centers. And so even in a smaller scale, there's some concern that many Oregon communities would not be receptive to siting new facilities near their communities. And there may be some health and safety concerns that maybe needed to be addressed. Okay, and if we go to the next slide. So looking at electrification or evaluating the barriers of kind of strategic use of fuels, because the model does find that, you know, an easy to electrify applications, or somewhat easy, I should say, that, you know, those applications should be electrified. And so what are the other areas? What are the strategic ways that the state can use fuels within the different sectors? So we broke it up by transportation, industry and agriculture, and residential and commercial. So in the transportation sector, a group that found that consumer awareness and understanding of electrification and use of low carbon fuels is a significant barrier. And I think that's reflected in the transportation electrification group and some of the other groups that we've heard from today. And that, you know, existing infrastructure may not be able to meet strategic uses of low carbon fuels in industry and agriculture. And I think that speaks to your question, Aaron, that you mentioned about kind of the role of fuels. Is it getting access to it? Is it just having the fuels available within the market, or how to use them as far as the end use application? And, you know, all those barriers came up. It's both those things as a concern within our group that we've talked about. And as far as residential and commercial, again, the upfront costs of retrofitting buildings and fuel applications in these buildings, but also in each of these sectors is a significant barrier. And there's real concerns around the lack of support or lack of financial or educational support for Oregon communities or Oregon businesses that will need to transition. And so that's certainly highlighted as a barrier. Okay, maybe we go to the next slide. And then in our fourth category, reflecting the key model findings, demand declines over time. So these barriers were categorized by consumer behavior, cost affordability, infrastructure, and supply. In the consumer behavior category, you know, there's concerns around kind of the awareness and confidence in electrification. That was identified as a barrier. So for example, some consumers may prefer to cook on a gas range, or may be reluctant to change how they use fuels today, and that may slow electrification. And in the cost and affordability category, the cost of electricity is a potential barrier. If electricity is increasingly more expensive, electrification may become less cost-effective as an option, and the economics of that may be challenging for some consumers and businesses. In the infrastructure category, declining fuel demand will likely be challenging for the existing regulatory framework and business models of fuel suppliers. So, you know, identifying that as a barrier, and as we start moving into the solution space that some of our presenters have highlighted today, we'll have to try to address that and talk through that as much as we can. And related to fuel supply, there is a concern around the volatility of low carbon fuel programs and market pricing, and the challenge that is for Oregon businesses, whether in transportation or industry, to kind of plan for that, of what that pricing might look like over time. Okay, and so I'll pause here and see if there are any questions, as I ran through that kind of quickly.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
Not seeing anything coming up. Let's go to Lauren, and then we'll move into conversation. As I said, folks, we're going to have some time for discussion, other questions as they emerge. Lauren?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lauren Rosenstein. I'm the facilitator for the Environmental Justice and Equity Working Group. This working group is here to elevate the concerns, barriers, solutions, and areas of interest within the field of environmental justice and equity to support the development of policy recommendations for the Oregon Energy Strategy. During our first meeting as a group, we reviewed the modeling key takeaways from each of the other working groups and then moved into a brainstorming exercise to name barriers associated with those takeaways from the perspective of environmental justice and equity. Next slide, please. While we identified barriers specific to each of the other working groups' focus, there were some universal thoughts that came up across the board. There seemed to be about 4 buckets, like the big buckets. One was program development, which had crossover with infrastructure, both energy systems and program or incentive infrastructure in many areas. Affordability, education resources and tools, and workforce. And those focuses are listed on the slide. I won't read them out since we're running a little behind, but I know you all are going to get the slides and you can read through them. Additionally, there's different barriers and needs for specific communities, like homeowners, renters, the type of housing, like single family, multifamily, and manufactured housing. There are some governmental barriers, like the lack of agency collaboration or ability to stack incentives and the lack of consumer protections for emerging technologies. A general barrier of access that may be due to utility constraints, language access, geography, education, or information sharing. And finally, some big picture environmental concerns like the burden and impact of mining and the disproportionate exposure of hazardous conditions to environmental justice communities, both in the location of some technologies and the inability to access beneficial technologies. Right now, we're looking across the working groups to analyze the barriers that are coming up, understand their intersection to environmental justice and equity, and then we, ODO, will provide that information to the working group members so that we can layer perspectives. Our next meeting isn't until April 14th so that we can hear from all the other working groups to address much of what you've heard today, as well as what the EJ and equity working group members are surfacing. That's it for me. I think I pass it back to Edith.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, so I just want to tee up the discussion briefly. First with an apology. I'm sorry, we're like being a big downer today. We're just talking about challenges and barriers. We're in that negative space, but it's an important space to suss all of that out. So it is what it is. So thank you for bearing with us. You know, I just want to also make a point on our process internally. So we're reflecting back here everything from the meeting. So not just everything that was written on those sticky notes, but also what was said, what was in the chat. We have a great colleague here, Hugh Arsenault, who organizes all of that information that we're synthesizing for you, and we're part way. So Jennifer, for example, I appreciate your comment on the point on COUs, and even in the comments that we received, there were differences, and so we've kind of rolled things up here quite a bit. In the final report, we're going to be very careful with our words, but in the meantime, I think it's really important to hear your comments along these lines, because they also help us do some of that adjustment on the fly as we're working through the comments that we've heard and the discussions that we've heard. Because as you all know, no matter how long you make a meeting, you're never going to hear from everybody, and you're never going to get a fully balanced perspective. And so that's our challenge, and that's part of why we're here talking to you today. So I just wanted to make that point and to say that, you know, as you can see here on the slide, we're really interested in any additional clarifying questions, anything you'd like to elaborate on that we've talked about, a particular challenge or barrier that where you'd like to provide a deeper perspective for our consideration, or more broadly, is there anything that you're hearing on these topics that you'd like to share, you know, outside of working group meetings, even just anything else that you're hearing about that you think would be worth elevating in the discussion here. So with that, I'm just gonna open it up and hand it back to Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Edith. So with that as context, other thoughts, reflections, questions? Jennifer, yeah.
I was just going to mention, you know, one of the themes, and I think it did come out in some of your work groups, but in the capital here, the affordability question and how these policies all relate to utility affordability and keeping, the goals for decarbonization in balance with affordable prices for consumers. So.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, Fred?
Morning, everybody. Yeah, it's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. A couple thoughts. Affordability is a really good place to start. It's a really big problem already. It's going to be more of a problem going forward. And, we're all kind of grappling with this. There are lots of drivers for that. Certainly wildfire is a really big one, as we heard. I was not on the hearing this week, but we heard from both investor-owned and publicly owned utilities on the hearing on House Bill 3666 that all utilities are experiencing big cost drivers from that. And, sorting out how that needs to proceed is a really big issue, in addition to all the issues we see with basically effectively grid modernization, new resources needed to meet the new loads, especially the big industrial and data center loads. I mean, on a long list, but affordability has got to remain a central focus of, in my view, of the outputs from this whole strategy. A couple little things, and I will not try to comment on every different thing, but first of all, I noted the comments about heat pumps. I guess my comment on that is, let's look at the empirical evidence about performance. We still hear that they don't work below 30 degrees. Mine worked fine when it got down to 22 this winter. But that's not the point. I mean, anecdotes are anecdotes. We have a lot of data, not just for that issue, but for many issues that I think we can call on to put some substance into, directional conclusions about where these different technologies are going. Related to that is the whole question of demand response broadly, or I would say now we're talking a lot more about, PG saying virtual power plant, whatever you want to call it, customer energy resources organized in effective ways across all the different categories. And the value that provides, we believe, is a lot larger than is perceived, but it's really difficult to get to. And again, PG's experience with the smart grid test bed and all their other range of demand response and related activities is the real challenge there is making it all work together. We know, and we have lots of data about specific measures, but the integration aspect is the really big challenge. And I really think that we need to support our utilities and our communities and customers in getting through that, because the value is really big and will be a lot greater going forward. And the last point I want to make is about resource we really haven't talked much about, which I have now come to believe is actually something we need to take a lot more seriously. Things are moving really fast for geothermal, and not just for the kind of geothermal that's still being, explored, developed at Newberry Crater, the company there now called Mazama Energy, but the lower temperature geothermal, the US DOE sponsored projects in Utah and now in Colorado, the Forge project and the Glade project are really laying the groundwork for what I actually I've always thought of geothermal as being like 15 years in the future. Now it looks like more like it's 5 years in the future. And we have an opportunity here in the strategy to think more about what that looks like. There are lots and lots of unknowns right now, but I think it's one of the most interesting things moving out there on the energy landscape. So thanks.
Thanks, Fred. Aaron?
Thanks, folks. Appreciate the conversation today. I'd say one thing that's been standing out to me in this discussion is that we are starting to identify a couple of areas where folks are seeing some real no regrets actions in the near term, and that's amazing and exciting. But I also want to maybe make sure that we are thinking about some of those longer arc transitions that we are preparing for. In places like clean fuels, we are seeing that we will need to really figure out some strategies and solutions in that space if we want to hit our long-term climate goals. And I just want to make sure that we're not losing the thread on those conversations, that we are making time and space for some of the bigger strategic discussions while we have opportunities to put into place some of the foundational tools and policies that we are discussing here. We really want to give our businesses, our industry, the signals that they need to start making strategic investments, to start bringing products to market, to start ensuring that we're ready for the transition that folks are talking about. And so I don't want to get in the way of those near-term actions. Those are important. Let's keep them moving. But please, let's make sure we do save some time and energy for this longer arc discussion. So thanks all.
Thanks, Aaron. Jeff?
Okay, am I unmuted? Looks like I am. Great.
I
Okay,
hear you.
great. Thank you. I always check. A little bit more on the clean fuels issue. I think that's that was a very good presentation. Again, all these presentations have been really great. I'm not entirely sure if we need new natural gas coming into Oregon to address the data centers, but if we do, I want to make sure that at least there's somewhere in the report that it mentions that these need to be safe and reliable, that the high quality construction. I'm seeing reports from Energy and Environment Daily and others about inspectors who have found major flaws in existing pipelines, such as TC Express, TC Energy pipelines, where there are leaks, there are flaws, there are cracks, etc. And when those inspectors identify those, they lose their jobs. That's been confirmed now. So that's not a good strategy. I want to make sure that if we have pipelines in Oregon, that they are really well constructed, safe, monitored, inspected, and that the pipeline companies have liability insurance so that the Oregon taxpayer does not get left holding the bag when there is a major fire, forest fire, or explosion. So just one little piece there to add to the barriers.
Thank you, Jeff. Other question, Diane?
Yeah, thank you. Diane Brandt, I'm with Renewable Northwest. I guess I'd just like to, in the spirit of kind of thinking big picture on the transmission system especially, and I think it might get to some of what Jennifer's been bringing up, and really helpfully to remind us that Oregon is served both by IOUs and COUs. At the root of that, though, is also the bifurcation of our transmission system. And so as we're starting to discuss how do we move forward on the transmission side and the generation, which relies on ability to access and connect to transmission, how do we reconcile these different structures that we have in our state? So just to flag that as a potential multi-layered policy piece of recognizing that 75% of our transmission infrastructure in Oregon is federally owned and operated. And how do we work with that when we're trying to address these barriers and steps to move forward? So thank you. Appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions, points of clarity, points of emphasis? Yeah, Mary?
Thank you. One suggestion I have is as we look at all the possible near and long-term policy outcomes that come out of the strategy, or the policy recommendations rather, as we look at those, if we could, I think, have a conversation about the prioritization of goals. Obviously affordability and quality of life are highly important. What is the role of economic development, or is that valued or prioritized when we think about decisions here? I think it'd be really helpful to have a sort of framing once we have the stack of policy recommendations and where those sit on different, priority stacks, if you will. I think that might be varied across the group, but I think it would be pretty representative of the state, and I think a useful exercise. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mary.
Hey, Ben, I just want to flag Andrea Kreiner in the chat she added a comment, and since she's not able to speak, maybe you could share that with the group.
Yeah, thank you for catching that. So from Andrea Kreiner, OECD, I would like to see the policy discussion address how to incentivize the use of rooftop solar in Western Oregon, particularly on the great amount of commercial rooftops. Also on the rooftop of the large distribution centers, et cetera, northern, central, and northeastern Oregon. This is a great number of acreage that, as stated, could reduce the pressure on Oregon ag lands. Thank you, Jessica, for calling that out. Andrea, for your comment. This will create a little more space if there's other things that are coming up for folks. Okay. Well, thanks, team. Appreciate folks' comments, questions, and points of clarity. So let's move back in. We'll do some closing, talk about next steps, and end on time here. So back to you, Edith.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And thanks everybody I've been furiously taking notes as we've been talking. So appreciate the all of the comments just now. So I just have this slide up here as a reminder of that step-by-step process. I don't think I need to go into it more, but just to remind you, we just talked about all of the hard stuff, or the downers, the reason it's hard to do things. That was meeting 2, and we're going to be moving pretty quickly now into strategies to overcome barriers, and then move towards policy, recommended policy actions, and really kind of getting into it. If we go to the next slide, I think the next one's a little more helpful in thinking through kind of where we are. Oh, and I'm sorry, Mary, can you click through? I didn't realize these were still animated. There we go. Thank you. So you can see where we are today. So we've had that first round of meetings for each of the working groups in that column that's February 12th through March 5th. We just had 3 meetings kind of back to back over the past few days. And then you can see where we are today. So on one update for you all is that we have changed the date for the presentation of the complementary analysis. So that's that energy wallet, which we'll get deeper into understanding what kind of the shift in energy consumption patterns means in terms of changing household costs over time for different representative households. So we'll have that energy wallet presentation, we'll have the results of the air quality modeling, and also the geospatial mapping that we've presented to you a couple of meetings ago. And that's happening on April 9th. And then we'll also have our EJ and Equity group meeting, and the Transportation Electrification group will meet before we all come back together on April 23rd. And so that April 23rd meeting, I think, will be really critical, because it'll come just before we really dig into those policy discussions in the working groups. You can see that we have 4 working groups meeting on April 30th, so it's going to be an intense day for Odo. And then on May 7th, we'll have the 5th one meeting, and those meetings are really where we're going to be digging into discussing what our policy options might be, and kind of we're in the early stages of preparing for those meetings. But since we're meeting pretty soon before then, I expect that we're going to want to share with you kind of where our thinking is and get some feedback on that. And I just want to bring back up the idea of meeting in person for that meeting, because I think it'll be more of a conversation, and I think it's easier to have this kind of conversation kind of around a table as much as possible. We'll make sure that there's a virtual option in case anybody isn't able to come, but I'd like to kind of put it to the group here. And if anybody has a, I don't know, Ben, how you want to do this, but we sent around kind of a poll to see what people thought. And we got quite a few responses that April meeting would be a good one to have in person. And there was a preference for Portland. So I guess if anybody's strongly opposed to that or has a problem, maybe that's the way to frame it up, to see if you want to raise your hands. Because there was pretty strong consensus, but what we didn't hear from everybody about the idea of doing that meeting in person.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. So I guess if you're strongly opposed, that could be the piece. Otherwise, if folks are on camera, if you want to just give a thumbs up that you'd be supportive, or if, folks in the, who aren't on camera, if you click the reactions, you can do a thumbs up or something, but just create some mechanism, or if you want to type in the chat, okay, good, something like that, so. I don't want to put people on the spot to be the downer that doesn't want to do it, but if you have some concerns, it's worth sharing. Okay, I'm seeing mostly thumbs up, probably consistent. Thank you, Jennifer, for the comment. Yeah, so I think, Edith, what I'm seeing is largely thumbs up. So I think if folks do have any concern about coming with in person, please email the team and just let us know if there's a concern. So if you don't want to articulate it today, but generally I'm seeing a bunch of thumbs up support. So it seems like it aligns with what you heard previously. But please let us know, like, we do want to make sure if we can take advantage of the space, it is often really powerful to be together in place, in person, with that virtual option, but certainly reach out to us if there's any concerns you have about moving in that direction.
Thanks, Ben. And we recognize that it's not always easy for people to shift their schedules around and to be able to do the travel. So definitely reach out if you have any difficulty. So, I mean, with that, I think that just appreciate your time. Thanks for being flexible with us. And I think it made sense to shorten this meeting. We don't need to use up the 3 hours when we don't have 3 hours worth of content, but I think that we had a good discussion. And just a reminder, Mary, if you go to the next slide, that we have a comment portal. It's always open. We have been reviewing it following each of the working group meetings to see if anybody has additional comments they want to add, or if there was somebody who was listening in to a working group meeting who wanted to add anything. So we actively monitor this portal. It becomes most active, of course, when we ask for written feedback on something, and that'll come. But in the meantime, we do monitor this. So I just wanted to remind folks of that, and thank you all for joining us this morning.
Awesome. Well, with that, you get not only the hour and a half of the rest of the previously scheduled meeting and 5 extra minutes. So appreciate everybody's space and time today. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and we'll see you next time. Take care.